I didn't want to go. I'd heard the rumors like everyone else in town about Blackwood Manor, the old Victorian horror that loomed over our tiny, forgotten town. But when my friends showed up that Halloween night, grinning and clutching flashlights like we were still kids, I caved. There was something irresistible about that place, a sick kind of thrill that tugged at the edges of your curiosity. It was the forbidden place, the place you never dared look at too long for fear it'd look back. The house was barely visible against the blood-red sky, its tall, jagged silhouette pressing up against the darkening horizon. Ivy clawed up its crumbling facade, weaving into cracks and broken window panes. It felt like stepping into a nightmare as we trudged up the hill, our footsteps the only sound against the rustling leaves. The wind seemed to carry voices, whispering secrets we couldn't quite make out. Jake, our self-appointed leader, chuckled nervously, masking the tension we all felt. "Just a house," he said, looking at the rest of us like he was trying to convince himself more than us. The other two, Sam and Mike, exchanged a look, their bravado fraying at the edges. I just stayed silent, my eyes locked on the front door, which had creaked open just enough to look like it was inviting us in. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, pretending my heart wasn't pounding. My flashlight cast a weak beam over the doorway as I crossed the threshold. The air inside was thick, damp, and cold, a sharp contrast to the outside chill. Dust floated in the beam of our flashlights, as if disturbed from decades of slumber, and I could feel the age of the place pressing down on me. We walked in silence, our footsteps crunching over debris and broken glass. The entryway opened to a grand staircase, its balusters twisted and rotting. A faded portrait of a stern-faced woman hung above it, her eyes almost following us as we moved. "This is the place," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yup," Jake replied, barely loud enough to hear. We moved forward, our footsteps seeming to echo louder than they should have. The place reeked of neglect, with cobwebs stretched like veils across the grand staircase and heavy dust layering the broken furniture. It felt like we were intruders, disturbing something that had long since been left to rot. As we wandered further, I began to notice the temperature. It dropped quickly, unnaturally, making our breath visible, even though we hadn't gone that deep into the house. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the bone-deep chill that seemed to settle over me like a shroud. "All right, that's weird," Sam muttered, trying to laugh it off, but there was no humor in his voice. Then we heard it, a whisper, low and nearly inaudible, echoing from somewhere deeper in the house. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A warning, a threat, something sinister lurking just beyond our sight. The laughter and chatter died instantly, replaced by a tense silence as we all looked at each other. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake tried to brush it off. "Just the wind," he said, though his eyes betrayed his nerves. But we all knew that was no breeze. We pressed on, each room more unsettling than the last. The place was enormous, with doorways leading into dark, forgotten rooms, their once elegant decor now withered into twisted reminders of a time long past. We stumbled into what must have been a nursery, judging by the dusty toys scattered around. In the corner, a rocking horse creaked back and forth, and I swear it moved all on its own, a slow, gentle sway that sent a chill down my spine. "Let's get out of here," I said, but no one responded. They were transfixed, staring at something behind me. I turned slowly. That's when I saw him, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the shadowed doorway. His face was obscured, but his eyes shone, cold and lifeless, like he could see straight through us. He raised a bony hand, his finger pointing directly at us. "Get out." The words echoed through the room, low and drawn out, like the creaking of old wood. But it wasn't just the words. It was the feeling they brought. An oppressive weight seemed to settle over the room, pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. Panic surged through me, every instinct screaming to run. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the scattered toys as I pushed the others towards the door. "Go! Now!" I shouted, my voice breaking. We bolted, our footsteps a frantic, chaotic rhythm, as we fled down the hallways and through the empty, decaying rooms. I could feel something following us, something dark and cold, its presence nipping at our heels. Every shadow seemed to shift, every corner a place where something was lurking, waiting for us to stumble. We reached the front door, slamming it open with all the strength we had left. The night air hit us like a splash of cold water, shocking and real, as we tumbled out of that cursed place. The silence outside was deafening, the normal sounds of the night swallowed up by the unnatural quiet that clung to us. Jake turned to look back at the house, his face pale and his eyes wide. Did you see it?" he asked, his voice shaking. None of us answered. There was no point. We all knew what we'd seen, what we'd heard, and there was no way to explain it. We stumbled back down the hill, our footsteps quiet, the laughter and bravado gone, replaced by a bone-deep fear that we'd taken something with us, that a part of that house had wormed its way into our souls. And as we left, I could swear I saw those empty windows watching us, the house alive and aware, marking us as its own. We never spoke of that night again, and none of us dared return. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that whisper echoing in my mind, soft, insistent, and terrifying. "Get out." I still remember that Halloween night vividly. It was supposed to be another night of laughs, a prank to remember, something we'd tell everyone about at school the next day. But I was wrong. We all were. That night would be burned into our memories for a much darker reason. We were known around the neighborhood as the pranksters. Every Halloween we'd pull off stunts that left people talking until the next year. And this Halloween we had a new target, the Millers, the new family who had just moved into the old brick house on Elm Street. They seemed ordinary enough, maybe a little too ordinary, if you ask me. I mean, who moves to a place like this and doesn't join the Halloween madness? Their lights were off, no decorations, just the faint glow from a TV inside. But their kid, David, he was different. We saw him around sometimes, just standing in his yard, staring off at nothing like he could see things we couldn't. His parents rarely came out either. They didn't join any of the block parties or stop by to chat. They were an easy target for us, and I guess in our minds that justified what we did next. We pooled together our money to rent a projector from my uncle's shop. Jake, our tech guy, downloaded these creepy old images of ghosts and skeletons, made to look like they were floating and dancing in the air. The plan was simple. Set up the projector so that it cast ghostly figures onto the side of the Miller house. We figured it would give them a real scare, maybe pull them out of their shell. So we waited until dusk. The streetlights flickered on, and kids were starting to head back home, their bags full of candy, and their faces painted with the remnants of whatever they'd worn that night. We slipped through the side yard, crouched behind the bushes along the Miller's driveway, and set up the projector. I glanced at Jake as he hit the power button, the blue light from the machine spilling out onto the side of the house. And then it began. The image on the wall twisted and took form. A shrouded figure, half transparent, started to float across the bricks, its edges wavering in the breeze. It was perfect, eerie, ghostly, exactly what we'd planned. We tried to keep our laughter down, but it was hard, until I saw him. David. He was standing by the window, just staring at the wall. Not the kind of stare you'd expect from a kid who'd just seen something strange. He looked mesmerized, his face pale and drawn. It was like he couldn't even see us, like we weren't there at all. "Hey, he's not reacting," I whispered. "You think he's scared stiff?" Jake shrugged, too focused on adjusting the projector. "Maybe he's just a weird kid." But David started to move, pressing his hand against the glass like he wanted to reach the figure outside. His eyes were wide, fixed on the image with an intensity that was almost unnatural. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something didn't feel right. I glanced at the other guys, and they looked just as unsettled. Suddenly, the image on the wall changed. It wasn't a simple ghost anymore. The figure twisted and warped, its limbs elongating, reaching toward David's window, as if it could somehow break free of the projection. Jake fumbled with the projector, his face as pale as a ghost himself. "Dude, turn it off," I whispered, a knot tightening in my stomach. "I'm trying." He clicked the button again and again, but nothing happened. The figure on the wall started to change, its eyes forming, hollow and black, boring into the window, into David. David took a step back from the window, his face draining of color. I could see his mouth moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. The only sound was the hum of the projector, the rustling of the leaves in the wind, and the pounding of my own heart. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground. We couldn't move, couldn't stop watching. The figure seemed to break free of the wall, almost like it was crawling toward him. David's hand reached out again, and this time it was like he was inviting it in. Jake finally managed to pull the plug, and the image disappeared. The side of the house returned to its dull brick, empty, like nothing had ever been there. But David, he wasn't at the window anymore. We waited, frozen in place, hoping to see him run back, maybe yell or cry for his parents. But there was only silence. No one moved in the house. The lights stayed off. After what felt like an eternity, we sprinted down the street, barely able to breathe. No one said anything. There was nothing to say. The next morning I woke to the sound of sirens. Cops and neighbors crowded the Miller house. Word spread fast. David was gone, vanished. His parents were beside themselves, tears streaming down their faces as they answered the cops' questions. They searched the house, the yard, even the nearby woods. But he was nowhere. Gone without a trace. I wish I could say we owned up to what we'd done, that we told someone about the prank, about what we saw, but we didn't. Who would have believed us anyway? It was just a prank, a projection on a wall, a silly trick that should have ended with laughs and nothing more. But it didn't. A week later, we heard that the Millers were leaving. No one blamed them, but deep down, we knew the truth. We had seen something that wasn't supposed to be there. David had seen it too, and whatever it was, it took him. The guys and I don't talk about that Halloween. We hardly even speak to each other anymore. We've all tried to move on, pretend it was just a prank gone wrong, a figment of our imaginations. But I can't get David's face out of my mind. That look in his eyes, like he was calling something, welcoming it. I don't go out on Halloween anymore. I don't decorate, don't open the door for trick-or-treaters. Every October, as the leaves start to fall and the air turns crisp, I feel that same chill. And sometimes, late at night, I'll look out my window, and for a brief second, I'll see him, David, standing in my yard, staring up at my window, just like he did that night. And then just like that, he's gone. The town's annual Halloween festival had a reputation. the kind that echoed through quiet corners of bars and whispered gatherings. Each year some poor soul came back from the festival different, but people chalked it up to Halloween fever or too much cider. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses or any of the typical nonsense, so when I was dragged there by my girlfriend, Sarah, I figured it'd just be another gimmicky night. The streets were packed with people in all manner of costumes. Witches, ghouls, and masked faces darted from booth to booth, filling the air with laughter and music. For most, it was just fun, but there was something darker lurking underneath the bright lights and fake cobwebs. You could feel it if you paid attention. Sarah had insisted on dressing me up as a vampire, which I barely put any effort into, but she looked great in her black cat costume, even if she spent most of the night listening to the elderly storyteller everyone called Eleanor. Eleanor sat on a small wooden bench, weaving tales about the town's dark history. She spoke with an almost reverent tone, each story dripping with the kind of suspense that made you lean in to catch every word. "There are places," she said, her voice barely louder than a whisper, "where the dead and the living cross paths, even if it's only for a moment." Sarah shot me a glance, her eyes wide with the thrill of a good ghost story. But Eleanor wasn't done. She shifted her gaze, staring straight at me. "You don't believe, do you?" I shook my head, feeling slightly uneasy but unwilling to show it. She just nodded, as if she'd seen it all before, but her eyes held a warning, a quiet reminder that not everything could be explained away. As the night wore on, the crowd started to thin out, the laughter growing softer, replaced by an eerie silence that blanketed the streets. Eleanor caught up with us again just as we were about to leave, her gaze serious, unwavering. "You want proof?" she asked, her voice low. "Meet me at the crossroads at midnight. You might find what you're looking for." It sounded ridiculous, but a small, unshakable part of me felt challenged, as if I needed to prove I was right by going along with it. So, as the clock struck midnight, Sarah and I found ourselves at the crossroads, a quiet intersection just beyond the glow of the festival lights. Eleanor was already there, a somber figure in the shadows, her face illuminated by the dim streetlight above. "To see the dead," she said, "you have to call for them with all your heart. Someone you've lost, someone you miss deeply." I almost laughed, but the look on her face stopped me. She was dead serious. Sarah nudged me, her face filled with that same excitement from before, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of the unknown. So I played along. "Thomas?" I called out, mocking the tone of an old ritual. "Thomas, if you're out there, come on and prove me wrong." The words barely left my mouth when the air around us turned frigid, each breath forming thick clouds of mist. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like skeletal fingers reaching toward us. I felt a cold chill snake up my spine, and I glanced at Sarah, who was staring into the darkness, her face pale. Eleanor raised her hand, gesturing toward the shadows. There, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. It wasn't entirely human, more like a silhouette carved from darkness itself. But there was something unmistakably alive in the way it moved. I forced myself to look, but the longer I stared, the less sense it made. "Thomas?" Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. The figure took a single step forward, and in that moment, the ground beneath us trembled, the air filling with a sound that was neither a scream nor a whisper, but something in between, a dreadful, hungry noise that seemed to echo from every direction. Sarah gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure stretched, limbs twisting unnaturally, its face forming a twisted grin that seemed to grow wider with every second. "Enough," I muttered, backing away. "This is just some Halloween trick, right?" Eleanor just shook her head, her eyes locked on the figure. "Some things can't be explained," she whispered. "Some things don't have to make sense. This is beyond our world." The figure shifted, its eyes, if you could call them that, flickering with a faint glow. For a moment I swore I could hear a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. My stomach turned as a flood of memories surged through my mind, faces, voices, things I hadn't thought about in years. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Sarah's hand. But as we turned to leave, the figure lurched forward, closer, its shape distorting, warping, until it was almost close enough to touch. Then it spoke, a raspy whisper, a voice laced with malice. "Why did you call me?" My heart stopped. It wasn't possible, but somehow, in that twisted voice, I recognized my grandfather's voice, the one I hadn't heard since I was a kid. Memories of him flashed in my mind, the warmth, the laughter, but this was a mockery of the man I'd known. This was something else, something pretending to be him. "Please," Eleanor whispered, her face streaked with tears. "Let him speak." She reached out, but as her hand touched the figure's arm, it let out a deafening scream, a sound filled with pain, rage, and a hunger that defied description. The world seemed to bend around us, the very air warping as shadows surged forward, swallowing Eleanor whole. Sarah screamed, and in a panic, we stumbled backward, fleeing from the crossroads as the figure's voice echoed in our ears, laughing, mocking, promising we'd never escape. The next morning, the police found Eleanor's bench empty, her belongings left as though she'd simply vanished. No one knew what happened to her, but Sarah and I knew better. We left that town and never looked back. But the memory of that figure, of that twisted voice, haunted us, creeping into our dreams. Some nights in the dead of night, I hear that whisper again, a faint voice calling my name from the shadows. And every time I wonder if, one day, it'll be close enough to touch.